You are standing in England at the beginning of the 13th century, a land that appears calm when viewed from a distance. Fields are worked slowly, monasteries copy texts in silence, and villages follow rhythms that have barely changed in generations. Yet above this quiet surface sits a king whose private habits and personal obsessions will ripple outward into law, war, and memory. King John of England is often remembered for losing territory, arguing with barons, and sealing the Magna Carta. Less often discussed, but just as influential, are the intimate behaviors and whispered accusations that shaped how he ruled and how others responded to him. John became king in 1199, the youngest surviving son of Henry II. From the start, he lived under comparison. His older brother Richard had been a warrior king, admired even by enemies. John inherited not glory, but suspicion. Chroniclers quickly focused on his personality. They described a man who was restless, sharp-tongued, and deeply interested in the private lives of others. These writers were monks and clerks who valued restraint and routine, so when they noticed a king who disrupted domestic order, they wrote carefully but persistently. Daily life at John's court was not especially luxurious by later standards. Meals were heavy and repetitive. Travel was constant, beds were shared for warmth, privacy barely existed. In such conditions, every gesture became public. If a king lingered too long with a woman, if he laughed too freely, if he summoned someone at night, it was noticed. What John did with this lack of privacy would shape his reputation. Many accusations against John concern his treatment of noble families. Several sources suggest that he took an interest in the wives and daughters of his barons, not in a romantic sense, but as a demonstration of control. Whether every story is true is impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated moral failings to explain political conflict. Still, the consistency of the accusations across different regions and writers suggests that something real lay beneath them. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand medieval honor. A nobleman's power rested not only on land and soldiers, but on household stability. Marriage was an alliance. Children were heirs. When a king interfered in this private sphere, it was not seen as a personal insult alone, but as an attack on lineage and future security. Even rumors could weaken trust. John ruled in a time when kings traveled constantly. He stayed in castles, abbeys, and manor houses, often as a guest. Hospitality was expected. The host provided food, servants, and access. This created opportunity. A king was above refusal. If he expressed interest in someone within a household, resisting could have consequences. Chroniclers describe John as observant and deliberate, someone who watched how people reacted to his presence. At the same time, John was deeply suspicious. He kept detailed records. His clerks wrote down fines, favors, debts, and punishments. This habit extended to people. He remembered slights and leveraged secrets. If he knew a household feared scandal, he knew they could be controlled. Power in his reign was not only military, it was psychological. You can see this in how John handled marriages. He interfered frequently, delaying unions, demanding payments or granting permission as a reward. Marriage was a legal matter, under royal authority, but John used it aggressively. For a widow or heiress, the king's approval determined everything. Chroniclers imply that John sometimes used this power to force proximity, keeping women at court longer than necessary. Life at court itself was monotonous. Days were filled with petitions, meals, prayers, and travel. Entertainment was limited to music, storytelling, and conversation. In this environment, small personal dramas gained significance. A look, a summons, a favor granted or withheld could become a topic of discussion for weeks. John's court became known as a place of tension rather than celebration. It is important to note that medieval standards of morality were not modern ones. Kings were not expected to be faithful husbands in the way later societies might demand. What mattered was discretion and balance. Many rulers had lovers without provoking rebellion. What made John different was the perception that his desires were uncontrolled and weaponized. One story often repeated involves a noblewoman whose husband opposed the king. According to some accounts, John targeted the household deliberately, not only to punish the man, but to humiliate him publicly. Whether the event occurred exactly as described is uncertain, but the story spread widely. That alone tells you something. People believed it because it fit what they thought they knew of the king. John's own marriage added to the unease. He divorced his first wife, Isabella of Gloucester, on grounds of kinship, then quickly married Isabella of Angoulême, a much younger woman already promised to another man. This was a political decision with personal consequences. The jilted family turned against John, contributing to the loss of English lands in France. Once again, a private choice reshaped public events. At home, John's treatment of women became part of the larger narrative of tyranny. Barons who already resented heavy taxes and arbitrary justice began to frame their resistance in moral terms. A king who could not govern himself, they implied, could not govern a realm. This argument was powerful because it connected daily fear with constitutional principle. Meanwhile, ordinary people experienced these tensions indirectly. When barons rebelled, villages were burned, food was taken, and labor was demanded. A king's reputation for excess trickled down as real hardship. Moral stories were not abstract. They explained why fields lay empty and sons were taken for war. Chroniclers also mention John's habits of anger and suspicion, how he moved abruptly from charm to cruelty. These traits fed into stories of appetite. Desire was not limited to the body. It extended to control, possession, and dominance. In medieval thought, these were connected. A lack of restraint in one area suggested weakness everywhere. Yet John was not careless. He attended church regularly. He funded religious houses. He performed public acts of piety, especially later in life. This created a strange contrast. A king who prayed intensely, who feared damnation, yet who continued behaviors that alarmed his subjects. This tension made him fascinating to writers who believed history carried moral lessons. As you listen to this story, notice how quiet it is. There are no grand scenes of drama here, only repeated patterns, a summons, a delayed marriage, a rumor passed between households. This is how medieval power often worked, not through spectacle but through persistence. John's reign shows how personal habits, even when hidden, accumulate weight over time. By the time opposition hardened against him, John's reputation was fixed. When barons gathered to demand limits on royal authority, they did not speak only of taxes and laws, they spoke of trust. Could a man who invaded private homes be trusted with public power? Could a king who ignored restraint be bound by agreement? This question hung in the air as negotiations began, leading eventually to the charter that would define his reign. But as John faced his rebellious barons, how much of their anger was driven by politics alone, and how much by years of quiet fear inside their own households? As you move deeper into the reign of King John, you begin to notice how repetition creates consequence. What began as rumors and private anxieties slowly hardened into shared expectations. By the early years of the 1300s, many of John's barons no longer judged him by single actions. They judged him by pattern. In a medieval world where memory was long and forgiveness was cautious, patterns mattered more than explanations. John's court continued to move restlessly across England. This constant travel was not merely ceremonial. Kings traveled to assert presence, to collect revenue in person, and to remind subjects who held authority. Yet this movement also meant that no household felt safe from royal attention. A visit from the king could bring honor, but it could also bring intrusion. When John arrived, he did not come alone. He brought clerks, soldiers, servants, and expectations. You can imagine the preparation. Extra food gathered, servants reassigned, wives and daughters instructed on behavior. In noble households, women were often responsible for managing hospitality. They oversaw kitchens, linen, and guest arrangements. This placed them in unavoidable proximity to a visiting king. Chroniclers describe John as observant, attentive to these moments. His attention did not always remain within boundaries. Others considered safe. Over time, fear replaced courtesy. Barons began to see royal visits not as opportunities, but as risks. Some attempted to avoid hosting the king altogether, citing illness or poor roads. Others paid fines to delay his arrival. These strategies were costly and humiliating, but they reveal something important. Resistance began quietly, long before open rebellion. John's response to resistance was rarely measured. He interpreted avoidance as insult. In medieval kingship, refusal implied disloyalty. If a household tried to protect itself through distance, John often responded by increasing scrutiny. He demanded hostages, usually sons, as guarantees of obedience. These young men were kept at court, where they could be watched and shaped. Hostage was common practice, but under John it became more frequent and more threatening. At court, these hostages witnessed everything. They saw how favor shifted suddenly. They heard whispered stories. They learned which families were safe and which were exposed. When they eventually returned home, they carried these impressions with them. In this way, The atmosphere of the court spread outward, influencing how an entire generation of nobles understood power. John's financial demands also intensified during this period. Wars in France required money, and John was determined to recover lost territories. He imposed heavy scutage payments, fines paid instead of military service. These payments strained households already anxious about royal interference. Money and morality became linked. A baron who paid heavily still felt vulnerable. Payment did not guarantee safety from attention. In medieval thought, a king was expected to embody balance, strength without cruelty, authority without excess. John's inability to project restraint undermined this ideal. Even his supporters found it difficult to defend him publicly. When accusations surfaced, silence often replaced denial. Silence itself became evidence in the minds of critics. The church played a complicated role. Churchmen were among John's harshest critics, yet they depended on royal favor. Monastic chroniclers recorded stories of abuse carefully, often framing them as moral warnings rather than political attacks. They wrote about appetite not only in terms of flesh, but in terms of domination. For them, John represented disorder, a ruler who inverted proper hierarchy by treating households as possessions. John's conflict with the papacy further darkened his image. When he refused to accept the Pope's chosen archbishop, England was placed under interdict. Churches closed, bells fell silent, sacraments were withheld, ordinary people suffered spiritually and emotionally. In this context, stories of the king's private excesses gained new weight. A ruler who defied the church and violated households appeared doubly dangerous. You can imagine villagers whispering about these things. They did not know details, but they sensed imbalance. Their world depended on order. When that order seemed broken at the top, anxiety filtered downward. Crops still grew, but fear grew alongside them. Inside noble families, strategies changed. Fathers hurried marriages to remove daughters from risk. Widows sought protection through religious life. Some women entered convents, not from vocation, but from fear. These decisions altered family lines permanently. The king's behavior, whether direct or rumored, reshaped demographics and inheritance in subtle ways. John himself seemed increasingly isolated. Trust narrowed. He relied on a small circle of advisors, many of them administrators rather than warriors. This further alienated traditional nobility. They saw bureaucrats rewarded while old families endured humiliation. Resentment deepened. At the same time, John's temper worsened. Chroniclers describe sudden punishments, imprisonments without trial, and harsh treatment of enemies. The most infamous case involved the starvation of prisoners, including young nobles. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories reinforced the idea of a king ruled by impulse rather than law. In medieval thinking, cruelty and desire were connected. Both were failures of self-control. A man who could not restrain anger was unlikely to restrain appetite. This logic shaped how John was remembered. Each new act confirmed older suspicions. The barons began to speak among themselves more openly. Meetings were held under the guise of feasts or hunts. Complaints were shared quietly. What united them was not ideology, but exhaustion. They were tired of living cautiously in their own homes, tired of watching wives and daughters closely, tired of wondering what each royal visit might bring. You should notice how little spectacle there is here. No single moment sparks rebellion. Instead, it is the accumulation of unease. This is how many historical shifts occur. Slowly, invisibly, until suddenly, they are unavoidable. As opposition solidified, John attempted to reassert authority through force. Castles were seized, lands confiscated, hostages taken. Each action confirmed the barons' fears. Negotiation seemed impossible with a king they did not trust to respect limits. When talk of formal demands began, morality and governance intertwined completely. The barons did not only want relief from taxes, they wanted protection for their households. They wanted rules that even the king could not cross. Law became a shield against appetite. As pressure mounted, John's image hardened in the public mind. Chroniclers no longer hesitated. They wrote openly of shame and violation. Whether every accusation was accurate mattered less than the shared belief that the king represented danger within domestic space. By the time armies gathered and negotiations loomed, John faced not just political resistance, but moral judgment. His enemies believed they were defending more than privilege. They believed they were defending order itself. As you pause here, consider this. When the barons finally forced John to the negotiating table, Were they driven more by abstract ideas of law, or by years of quiet fear shaped inside their own homes? By the time you arrive at the final years of King John's reign, the atmosphere around him has grown heavy and narrow. The court still moves, the clerks still write, the bells still ring when they are allowed to ring, but trust has thinned to almost nothing. What remains is fear, habit, and the momentum of events set in motion long ago by private behavior that was never truly private. The meeting at Runnymede did not happen suddenly. It was the result of exhaustion. Barons were weary of guarding their homes as if they were fortresses. They were tired of watching their families with unease. The language they used when they finally confronted the king was legal and formal, but beneath it lay something deeply personal. They wanted predictability, they wanted limits, they wanted to know that power would stop somewhere. When John placed his seal on the agreement that would later be known as the Magna Carta, he did so reluctantly. To him it was a temporary concession, a way to regain control. To his opponents, it was a line drawn against intrusion. Among its many clauses were protections for inheritance, marriage, and lawful process. These were not abstract ideas. They were shields built from experience. You should notice how little the document says explicitly about morality. Medieval people rarely spoke openly about sexual misconduct in law. Instead, they framed protections around procedure. If the king could not act arbitrarily, he could not intrude arbitrarily. Law became a quiet answer to appetite. John never accepted this limitation. Almost immediately, he appealed to the Pope, arguing that the agreement had been forced upon him. The Pope agreed, declaring the charter invalid. This moment reveals much about John's character. He did not see restraint as stability. He saw it as weakness. Once again, his inability to accept boundaries widened the conflict. Civil war followed. Castles changed hands. Fields were trampled. Ordinary people suffered quietly, as they always did. For them, the king's reputation mattered less than the soldiers at their doors. Yet even among the chaos, stories persisted. John was still spoken of as a man who brought danger into households, not just armies into fields. As the war dragged on, John's health declined. Chroniclers describe him as restless and suspicious to the end. He continued to travel, continued to demand loyalty, continued to fear betrayal. When he died in 1316, he left behind a kingdom fractured but still standing. His son Henry was a child. Power shifted quickly to regents who understood that compromise was necessary. After John's death, something interesting happened. The Magna Carta was reissued, modified, and reaffirmed. What had been a failed compromise under John became a foundation under his successors. This transformation tells you something important. The problem was not the idea of restraint, it was the man. In the years that followed, John's reputation hardened further. Chroniclers wrote with less caution. He became a symbol of bad kingship. His appetites were described as uncontrolled, his temper as cruel, his mind as suspicious. Whether these descriptions were fully accurate mattered less than their function. They explained why restraint was necessary. For centuries, John served as a warning, not just about tyranny, but about intimacy. He was remembered as a king who crossed lines that should not be crossed, a ruler who failed to respect the quiet spaces where families lived. In a world where most people had little power, the home was sacred. John threatened that sanctuary. As you reflect on this story, notice how little spectacle defined its turning points. There was no single scandal that toppled the king. There was no public trial for his private actions. Instead, there was accumulation, fear layered upon fear, rumor upon experience, appetite upon authority. This is often how history moves. Slowly, through habits, through daily choices that seemed small at the time. John likely did not see himself as exceptional. He acted as many powerful men had acted before him. What made his reign different was timing. England was changing. Administration was growing. Memory was being written down. People were beginning to imagine law as something stable. John stood at the edge of that shift and failed to adapt. His inability to govern himself made others determined to govern him. In this way, his personal flaws contributed to one of the most important legal developments in history. When you think of medieval kings, it is tempting to focus on battles and crowns, but this story asks you to look elsewhere, into corridors, into guest chambers, into moments of unease that never made it into official records, but shaped decisions all the same. The legacy of King John is not only loss and rebellion, it is the reminder that power is felt most sharply in private spaces, that authority without restraint becomes intrusion, and that even the quiet fears of households can, over time, reshape the structure of a kingdom. As you let this story settle, consider this final thought. How many moments in history that later became law or revolution began, not with speeches or armies, but with ordinary people simply wanting to feel safe in their own homes? You now find yourself in France at the end of the 14th century, a kingdom that appears magnificent from a distance but feels fragile when you step closer. Paris is crowded, loud and uneven. Narrow streets carry the smells of tanneries, kitchens, animals, and damp stone. Bells mark the hours of prayer. Markets open and close with familiar regularity. On the surface, this is a land of ceremony and tradition. Yet beneath it lies a growing anxiety about the human body itself, its limits, its urges, and its failures. At the center of this anxiety sits King Charles VI. Charles became king in his early teens, inheriting the crown of France while still shaped more by tutors than experience. For several years, the kingdom was governed by uncles and advisors who treated rule as a matter of procedure and lineage. When Charles came of age, there was hope. He was described as handsome, courteous, and attentive to ritual. His early reign suggested stability, but very quietly, something else began to appear. Medieval people understood the body differently than you do today. The body was not just flesh. It was a system of balances: heat and cold, moisture and dryness, desire and restraint. When balance failed, illness followed. When illness followed, the soul was thought to be at risk. Kings, whose bodies symbolized the health of the realm, were watched closely for signs of imbalance. Charles began to experience episodes that frightened those around him. At first, they were brief: sudden confusion, withdrawal, a failure to recognize familiar faces. These moments passed, and life resumed. But they returned. Each time, a little stronger, a little longer. Physicians were summoned. They spoke of humors, of overheating, of the brain, of exhaustion. Treatments were prescribed: baths, diet changes, bloodletting, rest. What troubled observers most was not simply illness, but unpredictability. A king who could not trust his own senses could not easily rule. Charles sometimes believed himself made of glass, afraid that physical contact would shatter him. At other times, he failed to recognize his wife or children. These episodes did not fit neatly into existing categories. They unsettled everyone. In this environment, attitudes toward the body grew tense. If a king's mind could betray him, then the body itself was suspect. Desire, touch, appetite, and pleasure were increasingly seen as dangerous. Charles' court became a place of caution. Movement slowed, interaction was regulated. Silence filled spaces once occupied by conversation. You should imagine the daily rhythm: servants waiting carefully, courtiers speaking softly, physicians hovering. Every gesture toward the king carried risk. A wrong word, a sudden movement, even affection could provoke fear. In this way, intimacy itself became a problem. Charles' marriage to Isabeau of Bavaria added another layer of complexity. She was young, foreign, and quickly placed at the center of power. When Charles was well, she remained a ceremonial presence. When he was unwell, she governed. This shifting authority created resentment. Whispers followed her through the corridors. Some accused her of excess, others of manipulation. The truth is quieter. She was navigating a court that feared the king's body and projected that fear outward. Because Charles could not always fulfill expected roles, others filled the gaps. Princes of the blood competed for influence. Each claimed to act in the king's interest. Each justified control as protection. The king's body became a political object. Whoever guarded it governed France. Moral expectations tightened. Pleasure was viewed with suspicion. Feasts were scrutinized. Clothing became more symbolic. The famous Bal des Ardents, a masked dance that ended in fire and death, shocked the court deeply. Though accidental, it reinforced the idea that bodily excess led to disaster. Afterward, restraint became more than virtue. It became policy. Ordinary people felt this shift indirectly. Taxes rose to fund wars and court expenses. Justice slowed as authority fractured. Yet sermons increasingly warned against indulgence. Preachers spoke of the dangers of flesh, of losing control, of inviting divine punishment. The king's illness shaped public morality. You should notice how different this story feels from that of King John. There is no accusation of deliberate intrusion. Instead, there is fear. Fear of touch. Fear of desire. Fear that the body itself cannot be trusted. Where John's appetite seemed aggressive, Charles' condition made appetite dangerous by its absence or unpredictability. At court, routines were adjusted to minimize stimulation. Noise was reduced, lighting softened, meals simplified. These changes reflected medical advice, but they also shaped culture. A quieter court produced quieter politics, but also more tension. Suppressed desire does not disappear. It waits. As Charles' episodes increased, his absences grew longer. During these times, others ruled in his name. Decisions were made without him, yet every decree still bore his authority. This disconnect created confusion. Who was responsible? Who was accountable? The king's body was present, but his will was not always accessible. Chroniclers struggled to describe this. They lacked language for mental illness as you understand it. They wrote instead of possession, imbalance, or divine trial. In doing so, they shaped memory. Charles was remembered not only as mad, but as fragile. His body became a warning. This fear extended to intimacy more broadly. If a king could lose himself through bodily imbalance, then others might as well. Excess was dangerous. Pleasure was unstable. Discipline was safety. These ideas hardened over time, influencing law, religion, and family life. As you listen, notice how power here does not corrupt through indulgence, but through uncertainty. A king unable to inhabit his own body fully created a vacuum filled by fear. That fear reshaped behavior far beyond the palace. By the end of this section, Charles' reign is defined not by action, but by avoidance. Avoidance of touch, avoidance of pleasure, avoidance of unpredictability, and yet, avoidance itself has consequences. As you pause, consider this unresolved question. When a kingdom learns to fear the human body because its king cannot trust his own, what happens to desire, intimacy, and ordinary life under such a shadow? As the years pass, you begin to feel how fear settles into routine. What once shocked the court of France now becomes expected. Charles VI's illness is no longer a disruption. It is a condition around which life is organized. Schedules bend, language softens, decisions slow, the kingdom learns to function around absence. When Charles is lucid, he is capable, attentive, even gentle. He listens to petitions. He participates in ceremony. He reassures those around him. These periods of clarity are precious, and the court clings to them, but no one knows how long they will last. Every interaction carries uncertainty. Every plan includes contingency. Because of this instability, power shifts constantly. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans compete openly. Each claims loyalty to the king, yet each prepares for moments when the king is unreachable. The court divides into factions, not over ideology, but over proximity. Who stands closest to the king when he is well? Who controls access when he is not? The king body becomes a guarded space. Rooms are restricted. Touch is regulated. Even speech is monitored. Servants are instructed to move slowly. Courtiers are advised to keep distance. The body of the king, once a symbol of strength and continuity, is now treated as fragile property. This changes how people think about bodies in general. Medical theory reinforces this caution. Physicians warn that strong emotions can trigger relapse. Desire is dangerous. Anger is dangerous. Excitement is dangerous. Calm becomes the highest virtue. In this way, self-control is medicalized. What once belonged to moral teaching now belongs to survival. You can imagine how this affects intimacy. Charles' relationship with his wife becomes distant and irregular. Isabeau is sometimes excluded entirely during episodes. At other times, she is relied upon heavily. This inconsistency fuels rumor. Chroniclers accuse her of excess, of infidelity, of greed. These accusations reflect less about her actions and more about anxiety. When the king body fails, blame searches for a target. The queen court becomes a parallel space. Here, decisions are made when the king cannot make them. Here, alliances form. Pleasure does not disappear. It moves. Music, feasts, and fashion flourish among those excluded from the king presence. This contrast deepens resentment. Some see decadence, others see coping. Ordinary people hear fragments of these stories. They do not know details, but they know instability. Taxes fluctuate. Justice is inconsistent. War drags on without clear direction. Preachers respond by emphasizing discipline. Sermons warn against indulgence. The body is framed as a site of danger. Desire must be controlled, lest chaos follow. The famous episodes of Charles believing himself made of glass spread widely. Whether exaggerated or not, they capture imagination. Glass is fragile, transparent, easily broken. The metaphor is powerful. A king who sees himself as glass invites subjects to fear their own fragility. The body is no longer reliable shelter. At court, clothing adapts. Padding is added, soft materials favored. Sharp objects kept away. These changes are practical, but also symbolic. The court dresses for caution. Over time, this aesthetic influences broader fashion. Softness becomes associated with safety. Excessive ornament with risk. The rivalry between noble factions intensifies. Each claims to protect the king. Each restricts others' access. In this struggle, the king's wishes are often secondary. He becomes a figure acted around rather than acted with. His body anchors power, but his will floats. This situation breeds resentment. Those excluded from influence accuse those within of corruption and indulgence. Moral language returns. Accusations of excess are leveled not only against the queen but against rivals. Sexual rumor becomes a political weapon. In a court obsessed with bodily control, any hint of indulgence becomes dangerous. Violence eventually erupts. The assassination of the Duke of Orleans shocks the realm. It is justified as necessity, protection, prevention. Once again, fear of disorder leads to extreme action. The body politic, like the human body, is treated through drastic measures. As civil conflict spreads, the king's illness becomes a symbol. Each side claims to restore balance. Each blames excess on the other. The fear of the body expands into fear of society itself. Disorder is everywhere. Control is the only answer offered. For ordinary families, this period is exhausting. War disrupts agriculture. Armies requisition food. Law is inconsistent. Yet moral pressure increases. People are told to restrain themselves, even as survival becomes harder. The contradiction is felt quietly, daily. Throughout this, Charles remains present but distant. He attends ceremonies without fully understanding them. He signs documents. He does not remember. His body continues to legitimize actions taken in his name. This disconnect becomes normal. As you rest within this history, notice how restraint becomes both protection and prison. Fear of the body prevents harm, but also suffocates life. Desire does not vanish. It hides. It reemerges in distorted ways. By the end of this section, France is no longer merely ruled by a sick king. It is shaped by sickness itself. Policies, morals, and relationships all bend around the idea that the body cannot be trusted. This leads you to an unresolved thought. When a society organizes itself entirely around fear of imbalance, what happens when balance finally breaks beyond repair? As the final decades of Charles VI's reign unfold, you begin to sense a kind of weariness settling over France. It is not the sharp fear of sudden illness anymore, but a dull acceptance. The king condition has lasted so long that it feels permanent. What once seemed like interruption has become structure. Life no longer waits for recovery, it adapts to absence. Charles' episodes increase in length and severity. During these periods, he withdraws almost entirely. He does not recognize those around him. He resists touch. He forgets his own name. Physicians continue their treatments, but hope has thinned. What remains is management, not cure. The court now functions in layers. At the center is the king body, protected, isolated, symbolic. Around it orbit councils, regents, and factions, all claiming legitimacy through proximity. Authority is no longer clear. It drifts, attaches, and detaches. This instability shapes everything. The fear of the body reaches its peak. Touch is avoided unless necessary. Desire is spoken of only in warning. Pleasure is framed as threat. Moral instruction becomes relentless. Sermons urge restraint, not as virtue but as survival. The human body is no longer a gift. It is a liability. Civil war deepens these anxieties. Armies, loyal to different factions, move through the countryside. Villages are burned, fields abandoned. Ordinary people experience the consequences of elite fear as hunger and displacement. Yet, even in suffering, moral pressure continues. People are told to discipline themselves when life itself feels out of control. Charles remains king throughout all of this. His presence legitimizes every action taken in his name. Treaties, executions, alliances, all carry his authority, even when he is unaware of them. This creates a haunting disconnect. Power exists without consent, rule without awareness. As years pass, a generation grows up, knowing no other kind of kingship. For them, fragility is normal. Absence is expected. Fear of imbalance is inherited. This shapes culture deeply. Art becomes more symbolic. literature more moralizing. The body is depicted as something to be guarded, corrected, or transcended. When Charles finally dies in 1422, there is no dramatic shift. The machinery continues. His son inherits not stability but fragmentation. The long shadow of bodily fear does not lift easily. It has shaped habits, expectations, and institutions. Looking back, chroniclers struggle to assign blame. Some condemn indulgence around the court. Others emphasize tragedy and misfortune. What remains consistent is the association between the king body and the kingdom health. Charles' reign becomes a lesson in vulnerability. Unlike rulers remembered for excess of appetite, Charles is remembered for excess of fear, fear of touch, fear of desire, fear of the body betraying the soul. His reign teaches a quieter lesson, that restraint, when driven by terror rather than balance, can become its own form of tyranny. As you settle into this ending, notice how different paths lead to similar outcomes, whether through uncontrolled appetite or paralyzing fear. Imbalance at the top reshapes everything below. Homes, laws, and lives bend around the condition of one body. The story of Charles VI asks you to consider this final reflection. When a society learns to distrust the human body because its ruler cannot trust his own, how long does that fear last, and how deeply does it shape the world that follows? You now move south, into the Iberian Peninsula of the 14th century, where Castile stretches across dry plains, fortified towns, and contested borders. This is a land shaped by long conflict, where Christian and Muslim kingdoms have traded territory for generations. Power here is personal, visible, and often violent. At its center stands a king whose reputation would echo for centuries under a single name: Pedro the Cruel. Pedro became king of Castile in 1350. Still young, still forming, from the beginning, his rule was defined by intensity. Chroniclers describe him as intelligent, decisive, and deeply emotional. He loved fiercely and punished brutally. Where other kings balanced desire with discretion, Pedro acted openly. His private passions spilled directly into public policy. In Castile, kingship was close. The court was smaller than those of France or England. Access to the king was easier. This made Pedro's behavior impossible to hide. His relationships, his anger, his affections were witnessed daily by those who depended on him. Pedro's marriage to Blanche of Bourbon was political and brief. Almost immediately after the wedding, he abandoned her. Instead, he returned openly to his long-term mistress, Maria de Padilla. This was not merely scandalous. It was destabilizing. Blanche represented alliance. Maria represented desire. Pedro chose desire without apology. You should understand what this meant. Marriage bound kingdoms. Rejecting a queen insulted allies. It weakened diplomacy, yet Pedro persisted. He installed Maria near the center of power. He honored her publicly. He fathered children with her. In doing so, he challenged expectations of royal restraint. Those who opposed this arrangement quickly learned the cost. Pedro punished perceived enemies harshly. Executions were swift. Imprisonments frequent. Chroniclers record sudden deaths and confiscations. Whether all were justified is debated, but the pattern is clear. Opposition was dangerous. Desire under Pedro was not private. It was a declaration. His love for Maria shaped appointments, rewards, and alliances. Those close to her prospered. Those loyal to Blanche suffered. The king's personal attachments redrew the map of influence. For ordinary people, this created confusion. Morality preached restraint, yet the king displayed excess openly. Authority and appetite were fused. This contradiction undermined trust. If law bent to desire at the top, what did law mean below? Pedro's enemies began to frame him as cruel, not only for his punishments, but for his refusal to hide his passions. They accused him of disorder, of violating natural hierarchy. Desire became political language. To condemn the king was to condemn his loves. As you listen to the beginning of this story, notice how quickly intimacy becomes power. Pedro did not merely want, he ruled through wanting. This would define his reign and determine his fate. By the end of this section, Pedro stands firmly in control, yet increasingly isolated. His passions have strengthened him in the short term, but they have also marked him as dangerous. This leads you to an unresolved question. When a king makes desire the foundation of authority, how long can loyalty survive before fear replaces it? As Pedro's reign continues, you begin to feel how intensity reshapes an entire kingdom. What first appeared as personal choice hardens into governing principle. Desire is no longer an element of the king character. It is the axis around which Castile turns. Every alliance, every punishment, every reward is filtered through proximity to the king emotions. Pedro's devotion to Maria de Padilla deepens rather than fades. He does not attempt discretion. He brings her openly into court life, granting her influence that rivals any queen. Courtiers quickly learn where power truly rests. They adjust their behavior accordingly. Loyalty is measured not by law or lineage, but by acceptance of the king attachments. Blanche of Bourbon, meanwhile, lives in enforced isolation. She is moved from fortress to fortress, guarded and forgotten. Her presence becomes symbolic rather than practical. To Pedro's enemies, she represents violated order. To Pedro's supporters, she is an inconvenience. Her confinement is quiet, bureaucratic, and relentless. It reflects how personal desire can be enforced through administrative routine. The reaction across Castile is mixed, but increasingly tense. Some nobles accept the situation out of fear or ambition. Others resist silently. A few rebel openly. Pedro's response is swift. Executions are carried out with legal formality, but emotional urgency. Chroniclers describe a king who listens to accusations personally, then decides immediately. Mercy is rare, hesitation almost non-existent. In this environment, intimacy becomes dangerous. To be close to the king is to be exposed to his moods. Favor can vanish overnight, a jest misunderstood, a rumor believed. Those who thrive learn to mirror the king emotions. They flatter his loves and echo his resentments. Court life becomes a performance of alignment. You should imagine how exhausting this is. There is little stability. Households rise and fall quickly. Estates change hands. Families are uprooted. The king's appetite for loyalty consumes social fabric. Trust narrows to immediate circles. Pedro's half-brothers, particularly Henry of Trastamara, become focal points for opposition. They represent an alternative not just to Pedro's rule, but to his style. Henry frames himself as a restorer of order. He criticizes Pedro's cruelty and excess. Desire becomes accusation. Pedro is portrayed as ruled by passion rather than reason. This framing gains traction because it resonates with lived experience. People have seen how personal affection translates into political violence. They have felt the unpredictability. Moral language gives structure to fear. Pedro, however, does not retreat. He doubles down. He justifies actions as justice. He insists that loyalty deserves reward, and betrayal deserves death. In his view, love and authority are inseparable. To love him truly is to obey fully. The church response is cautious. Clergy criticize excess in sermons but avoid direct confrontation. They depend on royal favor. Still, moral unease spreads. Confessors hear anxieties. Families whisper. The idea that the king desires too much becomes common speech. For ordinary people, consequences are indirect but real. Civil conflict disrupts trade. Taxes increase to fund military campaigns. Law becomes personal. Outcomes depend on who speaks for you. This breeds cynicism. Justice feels arbitrary. Pedro's insistence on legitimizing his children with Maria de Padilla further inflames opposition. He claims they were secretly married. This challenges succession norms. Desire now threatens the future of the crown itself. Fear intensifies. You can feel how Castile tightens. Every decision seems to provoke another reaction. Pedro's power remains strong, but it rests on narrowing support. His enemies grow not because he is weak, but because he is relentless. By the end of this section, the kingdom stands divided not only politically, but emotionally. Pedro has taught Castile to associate power with passion and punishment. This lesson will not fade easily. This brings you to an unresolved point. When fear and loyalty are bound together through desire, what happens when someone offers an alternative built on restraint? By the final years of Pedro's reign, you can sense how tension has hardened into inevitability. The kingdom no longer waits to see what kind of king he will become. It already knows. Desire has defined him, shaped him, and narrowed the paths available to him. What remains is consequence. Opposition coalesces around Henry of Trastamara, Pedro's half-brother, who offers something deceptively simple: order, restraint, predictability. Henry does not promise mercy for its own sake. He promises distance. Distance between power and appetite. Distance between the king's private life and public law. After years of emotional rule, this message finds fertile ground. Civil war becomes unavoidable. Armies move across Castile, towns choose sides cautiously. Loyalty is no longer personal alone. It becomes strategic. Many nobles who once feared Pedro now calculate survival. Some remember favors, others remember executions. Memory, not ideology, guides their choices. Pedro responds as he always has. With intensity, he commands personally. He punishes betrayal without delay. Yet something has shifted. Fear no longer paralyzes, as it once did. It motivates resistance. The very traits that once secured obedience now drive defection. Maria de Padilla has already died by this point. Removing the emotional center of Pedro rule, her absence leaves a hollow space. Pedro continues to invoke her memory, to legitimize their children, to justify his past actions. But desire without presence loses force. What remains is habit without anchor. As the conflict deepens, foreign powers intervene. Alliances form based on advantage rather than loyalty. Pedro's reliance on personal bonds proves fragile in a broader geopolitical struggle. Love cannot command armies forever. The final confrontation comes at Montiel. Pedro is captured through betrayal, the most intimate form of political failure. In a moment that chroniclers would later shape into symbol, Pedro meets Henry face to face. The struggle is brief and brutal. Pedro is killed by his brother. The manner of his death matters less than its meaning. A king who ruled through passion falls through personal confrontation. Desire that once bound loyalty now isolates completely. There is no ceremonial end, no ritual, just removal. After Pedro's death, Henry ascends the throne. He moves quickly to restore norms. He emphasizes law, counsel, and restraint. Chroniclers sympathetic to the new regime solidify Pedro's reputation as cruel. Stories sharpen. Excess becomes central theme. Memory is edited to serve stability. Yet, even hostile sources acknowledge something else. Pedro was consistent. He did not pretend to be restrained while acting otherwise. His openness made him dangerous, but also honest in a strange way. This complexity fades over time, replaced by simpler moral lessons. For ordinary people, the transition brings relief, mixed with loss. Violence decreases, but scars remain. Families remember who prospered and who suffered. The association between desire and danger persists. Intimacy and power are kept separate more carefully. Pedro's legacy becomes cautionary. He is remembered as a king who loved too fiercely and punished too quickly. A ruler who allowed private passion to govern public life. His story is used to warn future kings against indulgence, but also against transparency of desire. As you reflect on this ending, notice how different societies respond to excess. Some impose law, some impose fear. Castile experienced both. Pedro taught the kingdom that desire, when fused with authority, can fracture loyalty beyond repair. This story leaves you with a final thought. When power is exercised openly through love and hatred, does it fail because desire is dangerous, or because society demands distance between what is felt and what is ruled? You now step into England again, but not the England of fields quietly waiting for harvest. This is England still adjusting to conquest, still learning how to live under Norman rule. Castles rise where wooden halls once stood. French words slip into English speech. Power feels heavier, closer, and more permanent. At the center of this world stands William II, known to history as William Rufus. Rufus inherits the throne in the late 11th century. Following the death of his father William the Conqueror, the shadow he lives under is enormous. His father reshaped England through force and fear. Rufus inherits not a blank slate, but a tense arrangement of loyalties. Nobles hold land because the crown allows it. The church holds influence because the crown tolerates it. Nothing feels secure. From the beginning, William Rufus is described as different. Chroniclers comment on his appearance first. His red hair, his flushed complexion, his restless energy. These details matter because medieval writers believed the body revealed the soul. Rufus' body is read as a sign of temperament. Heat, impulse, intensity. Unlike many kings, Rufus never marries. He produces no acknowledged heirs. This absence becomes the defining feature of his reign. In a society where lineage stabilizes power, the lack of a queen creates unease. People notice, they speculate. Silence becomes suspicious. Court life under Rufus is loud and sharp. Chroniclers describe rough humor, sudden anger, and open contempt for restraint. Feasts are boisterous. Language is coarse. The king delights in challenging expectations. Where his father ruled through calculated dominance, Rufus rules through provocation. The church reacts strongly. Monks write of moral decay at court. They complain of mockery, irreverence, and indulgence. Yet these complaints often circle back to the same question. Why does the king refuse marriage? Why does he surround himself with young men? Why does succession remain unresolved? It is important to understand that medieval writers did not describe sexuality as modern people do. They did not categorize identity. They focused instead on order. Marriage was not about love. It was about structure. A king without a queen threatened continuity. Whatever Rufus' private life may have been, its public consequence was instability. You should imagine the daily rhythm of Rufus' court. Hunts dominate the calendar. Days spent riding, tracking, killing. The forest becomes an extension of the king will. Laws are enforced brutally to protect royal hunting grounds. Villagers are punished harshly for taking game. Appetite here is literal. The king's desire to hunt reshapes law. At court, relationships form through proximity, rather than family. Favor depends on access. Rufus elevates companions quickly. He dismisses them just as fast. This fluidity keeps everyone alert and anxious. Without a queen to anchor the household, the court lacks center. It drifts around the king moods. Churchmen criticize this environment fiercely. They link moral disorder with political danger. A king who refuses marriage rejects responsibility. A court without a queen lacks balance. These arguments are repeated often enough that they become accepted truth, regardless of the king's actual behavior. Rufus responds with indifference or mockery. He taxes the church aggressively. He leaves bishoprics vacant to collect their income. He treats spiritual authority as a resource rather than a guide. This deepens hostility. Moral critique becomes sharper. The king's private life is examined more closely. Rumors spread quietly. Chroniclers hint without stating. They imply excess without detail. This indirect style tells you something important. The problem was not a specific act. It was uncertainty. Ambiguity itself was threatening. For ordinary people, these tensions matter in practical ways. Heavy taxation funds military campaigns. Forest laws restrict survival. Justice feels arbitrary. A king without heir makes the future uncertain. Uncertainty breeds fear. William Rufus seems unconcerned. He governs as if time does not press. He hunts constantly. He surrounds himself with loyal companions. He avoids marriage negotiations entirely. Whether this is deliberate resistance or simple disinterest is impossible to know. What matters is how it is perceived. In medieval thinking, the king body represents the kingdom. A body that does not reproduce suggests blockage, stagnation. The absence of heirs becomes symbolic. Chroniclers interpret it as moral failure or divine warning. As years pass, this interpretation hardens. Every misfortune is linked back to the king lifestyle. Storms, famine, military setbacks, all are read as signs. The court without heirs becomes a kingdom without future. This section closes not with scandal, but with silence. Silence around the king's private life. Silence around succession. Silence that invites fear. As you pause here, consider this unresolved question. When a ruler refuses the most basic expectation of continuity, is the danger found in what he does privately, or in what he leaves undone publicly? As the reign of William Rufus continues, you begin to sense how absence can be more disruptive than action. Nothing dramatic changes at first. The king still hunts, the court still moves, taxes are still collected. Yet beneath these routines, uncertainty thickens. People are no longer waiting for something to happen. They are waiting for something that never comes. Marriage negotiations are the currency of medieval politics. They bind kingdoms, settle borders, and calm succession fears. Under Rufus, these negotiations never truly begin. Foreign courts send feelers, advisors raise the subject carefully. The king dismisses it with humor or irritation. Each dismissal is noted. Each delay becomes heavier. Without a queen, the court lacks a stable domestic center. There is no household anchored in lineage, no maternal presence shaping future heirs. Instead, the court revolves entirely around the king's personality. His moods determine rhythm. His interests dictate policy. This concentration of focus makes power feel personal and unpredictable. Chroniclers grow increasingly uneasy. They do not accuse directly. Instead, they describe atmosphere. They speak of excess laughter, of mockery, of restraint, of young men favored and rewarded. They write about clothing that grows finer, manners that grow sharper, and discipline that weakens. Whether these descriptions are fair matters less than their repetition. Over time, suggestion becomes assumption. The church intensifies its criticism. Bishops complain not only about morality, but about governance. Rufus' habit of leaving church offices vacant deprives communities of leadership. He treats spiritual roles as revenue streams. This reinforces the image of a king uninterested in continuity, not just of blood, but of order itself. Rufus' relationship with Archbishop Anselm becomes emblematic. Anselm represents restraint, learning, and discipline. Rufus represents appetite, immediacy, and control. Their conflict is not merely political, it is philosophical. Anselm insists that authority requires humility. Rufus insists that authority requires dominance. The absence of a queen amplifies this divide. There is no mediating influence. At court, favoritism remains fluid. Companions rise quickly, then fall. This instability breeds competition. Courtiers watch one another closely. Loyalty becomes performative. Without a clear future, everyone acts for the present. This creates a culture of immediacy. Enjoyment now, reward now, fear now. The king-hunting obsession deepens this culture. Forest laws are enforced harshly. Villagers lose hands, eyes, or lives for taking game. The forest becomes a symbol of royal appetite, unchecked by inheritance. Rufus does not hunt to provide. He hunts to assert. The act itself matters more than outcome. Ordinary people experience these policies as restriction and punishment. Land is taken out of use. Food sources are controlled. Survival becomes harder. The king's refusal to produce an heir feels distant, but its effects are real. A future without clear succession threatens stability. People worry quietly. Rumors continue to circulate. They grow more elaborate, but remain vague. Chroniclers hint at relationships without naming them. They imply moral disorder without detail. This ambiguity is deliberate. Medieval writers understood the power of suggestion. To accuse openly required proof. To imply required only repetition. Over time, Rufus becomes associated with a court that feels unanchored, a place without domestic rhythm. Feasts are frequent, discipline inconsistent, mercy unpredictable. The absence of a queen is no longer just unusual, it is blamed for imbalance. You should notice how morality here is tied to structure, not identity. The concern is not whom Rufus desires. It is that he refuses to channel desire into accepted forms. Marriage is governance. Refusing it appears irresponsible. Rufus seems unconcerned by this interpretation. He continues to rule aggressively. He campaigns in Normandy. He suppresses rebellion. He maintains control through force and fear. In many ways he is effective. This makes criticism more frustrating for his opponents. They cannot point to failure, only to danger. The longer the reign continues without heir, the more the future presses. Who will rule next? Rufus' younger brother Henry waits quietly. Nobles watch closely. Alliances remain tentative. Everyone knows that sudden death could change everything. This knowledge sharpens anxiety. Hunting accidents are common. Illness unpredictable. A king without heir invites speculation at every turn. Each time Rufus rides out, people wonder. The court grows accustomed to living without tomorrow. This is perhaps the most lasting effect. When the future is unclear, people cling to present favor. They indulge where they can. They protect themselves narrowly. Community thins. As you rest within this section, notice how silence becomes loud. The absence of marriage speaks more than any scandal. The court without heirs is not merely unusual, it is unstable by nature. This brings you to an unresolved point. When a kingdom grows used to living without a future, what happens when the present suddenly ends? As William Rufus' reign draws to its conclusion, you can feel tension crystallizing into inevitability. The king continues his routines, hunting, judging, receiving homage, but the undercurrent of uncertainty has become unrelenting. His refusal to marry and produce an heir has set the kingdom on edge, and now, years of speculation and anxiety converge into one decisive moment. In August of 1108, Rufus departs for the New Forest, a familiar hunting ground, but also a place steeped in danger. The forest itself becomes an extension of his rule, wild, controlled only partially, and a stage for fate to act upon. Chroniclers later describe the king's movements in detail. He rides ahead of the party. He is alert, yet impatient. Courtiers follow, some too close, some too distant. Every step carries consequence. Then it happens. An arrow strikes. Accounts vary, Some claim accident, others hint at conspiracy, but the outcome is the same. The king falls, mortally wounded. His companions attempt aid, but recovery is impossible. The king who never produced an heir dies without one. The court is thrown into immediate disarray. There is no queen to advise, no crown prince to guide. Succession becomes the kingdom's urgent question. Rufus' death illustrates how fragile governance had become under him. The machinery of state continues, but leadership is uncertain. Nobles gather to secure lands. Bishops convene to confirm authority. Everyone knows that the absence of an heir leaves room for ambition, for rebellion, for realignment. What seemed a private choice now ripples outward with force. Henry, Rufus' younger brother, is quick to act. He claims the throne. He is welcomed by many nobles who have grown weary of unpredictability. Some see him as restorer, others as opportunist. The kingdom transitions not through ceremony alone, but through pragmatism. The future is suddenly present, negotiated in haste. The court without heirs becomes a historical caution. Chroniclers write extensively of Rufus' character, framing him as bold, lustful, and unconventional. They note his disregard for expectations. Yet underlying these accounts is another truth. The danger was not simply behavior but absence. A court without continuity breeds fear, instability, and eventual crisis. You should imagine the immediate aftermath. Forests echo with rumor. Towns watch anxiously. Families wonder what the death of a king without heirs means for their property, status, and survival. Silence gives way to negotiation, negotiation to alignment, alignment to consolidation. Life continues, but shaped irrevocably by choices that were once considered personal. The legacy of Rufus is complex. He is remembered for audacity, for appetite, for a court that challenged norms, but he is also remembered for leaving the kingdom unanchored. His reign demonstrates that power exercised without foresight, without the deliberate creation of continuity, can destabilize even a strong monarchy. Desire and independence, unchecked, carry consequences that extend far beyond the individual. As you reflect on this history, consider how absence shapes systems. The failure to produce heirs was not scandalous in the way some kings' private indulgences were. It was quieter, less dramatic, but ultimately more destabilizing. The kingdom learned, painfully, that succession is not merely formality, it is the backbone of stability. This story ends with a thought-provoking question. When the future is left undefined by those at the top, how much of the present is shaped by fear, and how much by necessity, and how often are ordinary people the ones who bear the weight? You now enter northern Italy in the late 15th century, a patchwork of city-states where commerce, art, and politics collide. Milan stands as one of the richest and most ambitious of these cities, its streets filled with merchants, artisans, and courtiers, all moving to the rhythm of wealth and intrigue. At the center of this environment sits Ludovico Sforza, known as Ludovico il Moro, a man whose ambitions extend far beyond mere rulership. His court is a stage, and he controls both the actors and the shadows behind them. Ludovico ascends to power in Milan, as regent for his young nephew Gian Galeazzo. He is careful, calculating, and patient, waiting for the right moment to transform authority from temporary guardianship into permanent rule. In this way, his reign begins quietly, almost invisibly, within the structures already in place. But beneath that calm surface, secrets accumulate like dust in an abandoned corridor, quiet, unnoticed, yet capable of shaping the world. The Sforza family had risen through military service, not noble lineage. This fact colors Ludovico's approach. He understands the fragility of legitimacy and the importance of perception. Alliances are negotiated with precision. Enemies are managed through combination of diplomacy, marriage, and occasional violence. His appetite is not physical in the sense of previous kings we have examined. It is administrative, psychological, and social. He collects power in subtle ways. At court, appearances are everything. Ludovico presents himself as cultured, generous, and urbane. He hosts elaborate banquets, patronizes artists, and encourages the flourishing of literature and architecture. Yet every ceremony, every display, carries a subtext. Courtiers learn quickly that proximity to the duke is a double-edged sword. Favor brings reward, but it also exposes one to scrutiny, manipulation, and obligation. You should imagine the daily rhythm of Milan under Ludovico. Mornings begin with council meetings, where careful observation is valued over loud declaration. Afternoons are devoted to correspondence with allies and adversaries alike. Evenings are for public performance, music, conversation, and demonstration of refinement. Every hour is orchestrated to maintain image and control, and to signal both generosity and surveillance. The Duke's private quarters, by contrast, are a place of calculation. Here he reviews intelligence, considers plots and plans alliances. These moments are rarely observed, yet they determine the fate of the city. His understanding of human behavior is subtle. He knows that fear and desire often intersect in powerful ways. A courtier rewarded today may be coerced tomorrow. A gesture of kindness may signal dominance. Power is exercised as much through perception as through decree. Ludovico also understands the role of secrecy in governance. Information is currency. Knowledge of alliances, family tensions, or rivalries provides leverage. The Duke cultivates spies, informants, and networks of observation that penetrate the homes and habits of Milanese nobility. In this way, the boundaries between public and private blur. Nothing is fully hidden, but nothing is fully visible either. Marriage politics remain a critical tool. Ludovico arranges unions to strengthen loyalty and neutralize rivals. Yet these marriages are not only alliances, they are signals. Who is married to whom reveals the balance of power. Courtiers and foreign observers alike pass these decisions carefully. Every gesture communicates beyond the immediate moment. The arts serve multiple functions in the Sforza court. Patronage establishes prestige. Architectural projects impress allies and intimidate enemies. But beyond aesthetics, art becomes a method of control. Portraits, frescoes, and public spaces reflect not just beauty, but hierarchy. They reinforce the centrality of Ludovico authority. They also remind the city that power can be subtle and omnipresent simultaneously. Political decisions are similarly measured. Wars are waged selectively. Treaties are negotiated with care. The Duke rarely acts impulsively, but when he does, consequences are amplified. His approach contrasts sharply with kings whose appetites are immediately visible. Ludovico operates behind curtains, in corridors, in letters sealed with his authority. Yet these quiet manipulations often produce the same, if not greater, effect as open display of force. The danger for Ludovico lies in human unpredictability. Allies may betray, family may rebel, courtiers may misread signals. Success depends not on brute strength alone, but on continual observation, intervention, and sometimes intimidation. The secretive court is not passive. The secretive's not passive. It is active, alive, and constantly adapting. By the end of this section, you should notice the quiet tension that pervades Milanese life. The city is rich, the court is splendid, yet every act of obedience is measured, every smile is calculated, and every relationship carries potential consequence. Ludovico il Moro is a ruler whose power is exercised in whispers and glances rather than public spectacle. As this section closes, consider this unresolved question. When governance relies on secrecy, subtlety, and manipulation rather than open display, how much of the city's life and the lives of ordinary people can be shaped by what they never see, never hear, and never fully understand? As Ludovico Sforza reign deepens, the subtleties of his power become more apparent. You begin to sense how control in Milan depends not on the kingly spectacle of armies or pageantry, but on the quiet orchestration of loyalty, fear, and perception. Every interaction carries multiple layers of meaning. Courtiers learn to interpret gestures, silences, and private conversations as carefully as written law. The city itself becomes an extension of the Duke mind. Ludovico continues to consolidate authority while maintaining the illusion of regency for his nephew. Gian Galeazzo, technically the ruler, remains largely absent from decision-making. His youth and inexperience create both opportunity and risk. Ludovico acts decisively on this imbalance, steering alliances, negotiating treaties, and managing domestic unrest. The court grows accustomed to observing him, rather than the nominal ruler. In effect, power is both present and invisible, concrete yet veiled. The Duke's manipulation extends into family dynamics. Ludovico fosters loyalty in some branches while encouraging competition or rivalry in others. His niece and nephews, strategically positioned, are rewarded or punished depending on perceived allegiance. These interactions appear mundane, gifts, positions, ceremonies, but each carries the weight of political signal. Courtiers and foreign diplomats watch carefully. Small gestures become major indicators of favor or disfavor. In public, Ludovico projects refinement and sophistication. He hosts festivals, commissions art, and invites scholars to the court. These acts are not merely aesthetic. They reinforce authority and create a web of observation. Artists, musicians and scholars, are both instruments of prestige and tools of influence. They witness behaviors, carry messages, and help shape opinion. The court itself becomes a theater of subtle power, where appearance and reality intermingle. Behind closed doors, Ludovico cultivates intelligence networks. Spies report on both domestic and foreign affairs. Informants infiltrate noble households. Letters are read, sometimes intercepted. Decisions are guided not only by law or custom, but by knowledge of human weakness, desire, and ambition. This creates a court that operates simultaneously in plain sight and in secrecy. Influence becomes fluid, and survival depends on the skill to navigate unseen currents. Marriage alliances continue to serve multiple purposes. Ludovico arranges unions that strengthen his position or weaken rivals, but also monitors how his allies interact with one another. The subtleties of affection, negotiation, and proximity are as important as the formal legal terms. Courtiers are aware that a misstep in intimacy, even in public display of loyalty or flirtation, can affect their standing. Desire itself becomes a tool of politics, indirectly shaping appointments and favor. Military campaigns are carefully calculated. Ludovico rarely engages in open battle, unless victory is almost certain. Instead, he employs diplomacy, bribes, and intimidation. He leverages Milan's wealth to manipulate other city-states. The subtlety of his approach contrasts sharply with rulers who act impulsively. Here, restraint amplifies influence. Observation becomes action. Yet, this reliance on secrecy carries danger. Misinterpretation can be fatal. A whispered rumor may provoke conflict. A hidden letter may destabilize an alliance. Courtiers constantly navigate shifting loyalties, aware that the wrong gesture might result in demotion, exile, or disgrace. The threat is not immediate death, as with other rulers, but persistent vulnerability. Fear permeates daily life, influencing decisions and shaping behavior. The city itself becomes disciplined by the court's subtle control. Merchants, guilds, and neighborhoods adjust their actions according to perception of power. Festivals, markets, and civic events are not only social occasions, but opportunities to demonstrate loyalty or avoid suspicion. Ordinary people, though distant from court, feel the ripple effects of Ludovico's management. Stability emerges from fear tempered by observation, not from law alone. Art and architecture reinforce these dynamics. Portraits of the Duke appear throughout the city. Frescoes, statues, and public spaces depict hierarchy and reinforce authority. Beyond prestige, these symbols serve as constant reminders of the unseen networks governing life. Even without entering the palace, citizens understand that the Duke is everywhere, observing, orchestrating, and maintaining control. By the end of this section, Milan under Ludovico feels both vibrant and tense. The city thrives in commerce and culture, yet every interaction is subtly surveilled. Authority is omnipresent yet hidden. Success and survival depend on skill, discretion, and attention to nuance. Power is exercised quietly, but its effects are profound. As you consider the nature of this court, an unresolved thought arises. When governance relies on secrecy, manipulation, and perception, rather than public display or explicit law, how much of a city's life and the lives of its people are truly free, and how much is quietly dictated by invisible control? As Ludovico Sforza enters the later years of his rule, the full weight of his subtle orchestration becomes visible. Milan is at once flourishing and fragile. The city thrives economically, culturally, and artistically, yet underneath, the delicate web of alliances, rivalries, and secrets teeters. Power, once consolidated quietly, now reveals its limits. Influence maintained through perception is inherently unstable. Ludovico's nephew Gian Galeazzo grows into adulthood, but the nominal ruler has little real control. Ludovico retains authority through careful management of loyalty and fear. Courtiers continue to navigate this duality, balancing service to Ludovico with appearances of obedience to the Duke's ward. The line between public duty and private manipulation is blurred. This tension defines court life. Alliances across northern Italy respond to the Sforza court with caution. Florence, Venice, and the smaller duchies observe Milan's internal dynamics closely. They negotiate, bribe, and provoke strategically, aware that Ludovico's power depends not on armies alone, but on perception and subtle influence. Diplomacy becomes a game of interpretation, where misreading a gesture or overestimating a threat can have serious consequences. Within Milan, the intricate system of observation continues to shape daily life. Courtiers monitor one another, and even ordinary citizens adjust behavior based on inferred preferences and unwritten expectations. Festivals, trade, and civic rituals all serve as indicators of loyalty. Public appearance matters as much as private compliance. Ludovico's influence extends far beyond formal decrees. It is embedded in the fabric of social life. The arts continue to serve both prestige and surveillance. Commissions, dedications, and public projects signal favor and allegiance. Artists and intellectuals participate in this network, their work simultaneously celebrating the Duke and reinforcing his authority. Symbolism becomes a language of power, comprehensible to those who read carefully and perilous for those who misinterpret it. Yet, even the most carefully orchestrated system cannot eliminate unpredictability. Rumors, misunderstandings, and external pressures persist. Attempts to manipulate perception can backfire. A gesture misread, an alliance mishandled, or an enemy underestimated can unravel carefully laid plans. Ludovico's genius is managing these threats before they crystallize, but the potential for collapse is always present. In the final years of Ludovico rule, external conflict intensifies. France, seeing opportunity in Milanese political structure, intervenes subtly, supporting rival claims and encouraging dissent. Ludovico responds with diplomacy and tactical positioning rather than open confrontation. His approach exemplifies his method, power exercised not through immediate force, but through the slow, persistent shaping of perception, allegiance, and fear. Domestically, Milan maintains its vibrant cultural life. The ducal court continues to host music, theatre, and artistic projects. The city thrives economically, yet all activity is colored by the underlying awareness that Ludovico is watching, calculating, and adjusting. Behavior is disciplined, not only by law but by observation, and the consequences of misalignment are understood clearly. By the end of his reign, Ludovico il Moro demonstrates the enduring power of subtlety. He does not dominate through spectacle alone, nor through violent assertion of will. Instead, he controls through observation, information, and strategic manipulation of perception. His court, his city, and even neighboring states are all shaped by what they know and what they suspect about the Duke's intentions. The legacy of Ludovico Sforza is instructive. Power need not always be visible to be effective, yet it carries its own fragility. Systems built on subtle control require constant attention, and the moment attention lapses they are vulnerable. Milan flourished during his reign, but the intricate balance of secrecy, influence, and perception could not last indefinitely. The later invasion of French forces would eventually expose the limits of such careful orchestration. As you reflect on this story, notice the contrast with kings whose power relied on visible action, physical presence, or decisive displays of appetite. Ludovico's mastery was quieter, hidden, and psychological, yet equally transformative. His rule teaches a lesson about the enduring tension between public spectacle and private calculation, between open law and invisible influence. This story closes with a question to consider. When power is exercised invisibly, through observation, secrecy, and subtle manipulation, how much of life is truly autonomous, and how much is quietly orchestrated, without ever being noticed? You now travel north to Russia, in the mid-16th century, a land of vast forests, frozen rivers, and expanding frontiers. Moscow is the heart of this realm, a city of wooden towers, onion-domed churches, and streets that echo with both commerce and tension. At its center is Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, a ruler whose name alone would come to evoke awe, dread, and fascination. His reign begins with promise, but will soon be defined by fear, violence, and an obsession with control. Ivan inherits the throne at a young age, following the death of his father. From the start, the boy experiences loss and instability. His early years are shaped by noble factions fighting for influence, by hunger, cold, and betrayal. These formative experiences leave a mark on his psyche. You can sense how a ruler who experiences insecurity so early might grow to value absolute control above all else. Every decision in Ivan's reign will be shadowed by this past. Initially, Ivan exhibits promise as a leader. He centralizes power, reducing the influence of rival boyars or nobles, and begins codifying laws to strengthen the state. He is intelligent, articulate, and capable of strategic thinking. His policies expand the reach of Moscow, incorporate distant lands, and attempt to bring order to a realm that has long been fragmented. You might think that such a ruler would bring stability, yet instability seems to grow in parallel with his power. The boyars, threatened by Ivan's authority, respond cautiously. Many attempt to align themselves with him, offering loyalty and gifts. Others plot in secret, quietly undermining his position. The duality of his court, public obedience and private plotting, shapes the atmosphere. Every meeting, every feast, carries undercurrents of suspicion. A smile may conceal betrayal. A gesture of favor may be a prelude to punishment. Ivan's temperament complicates governance. He swings between charm and fury, kindness and cruelty. His moods shape policy as much as law does. Fear becomes a tool as well as a reaction. Courtiers quickly learn that misjudging the ruler can be fatal. Small mistakes, perceived slights, or untimely jokes are sometimes punished harshly. This cultivates an environment of constant alertness, where loyalty is both demanded and uncertain. Religious influence also plays a significant role. The Orthodox Church is closely intertwined with the state. Clerics often counsel restraint and mercy, yet Ivan's suspicions do not spare them. He demands loyalty and views spiritual authority as another sphere to control. The Church becomes both ally and instrument. Its teachings reinforce obedience, but Ivan manipulates their interpretation to justify punishment or reward. The Tsar's obsession with order extends to his personal life as well. Marriages, succession, and courtly interactions are monitored, manipulated, and sometimes weaponized. His wives and children live under constant surveillance. Favor and disfavor are highly visible, yet unpredictable. You can imagine the pressure of living in a court where the ruler observes, calculates, and responds to every perceived deviation. Ivan's rule demonstrates an intricate interplay between fear and loyalty. Public displays of power are frequent, but behind them lies strategy and psychology. He cultivates the idea that betrayal is everywhere, and that the ruler is always watching. This perception itself becomes a governing tool. People alter behavior not because law compels them, but because the shadow of potential punishment influences every choice. The early campaigns of Ivan's reign show both ambition and restraint. Military expeditions expand Moscow influence while avoiding unnecessary risk. Successes are celebrated publicly, reinforcing loyalty. Failures, however, are interpreted personally. A commander who miscalculates is not merely inefficient. He has offended the Tsar's perception of competence and must be disciplined accordingly. Fear becomes intertwined with achievement. By the end of this section, you can see how the foundations of Ivan's reign are laid. Moscow gains power, but at the cost of tension, suspicion, and unease. The city, the court, and even the countryside begin to operate under the shadow of the Tsar's presence. Ordinary people sense the undercurrents. Nobles learn caution. Fear begins to shape action as much as law. As you reflect on this first section, consider this unresolved question. When a ruler internalizes every threat and suspicion, how much of governance is actually about justice, and how much is about controlling perception, and at what cost to the people who live under that shadow? As Ivan IV matures, the patterns of his reign intensify. The early promise of law, order, and expansion begins to interweave with paranoia and cruelty. Moscow is no longer just a political center. It becomes a place where every corner, alley, and household reflects the Tsar's presence. You can almost feel the tension vibrating through the city streets, the marketplaces, and the courts, as everyone navigates an invisible landscape of suspicion. The boyars remain the focal point of Ivan's anxieties. These nobles wielded power before his reign, and are accustomed to influencing policy behind the scenes. Ivan's early attempts to curb their influence are only partially successful. He observes them meticulously, noting alliances, rivalries, and even subtle shifts in behavior. Small gestures, an overlooked bow, a delayed report, a whispered comment, can be interpreted as betrayal. Fear becomes the primary tool for shaping loyalty. Ivan's use of personal punishment evolves. Early in his reign, penalties are formal, following legal traditions and precedent. Over time, however, they become increasingly unpredictable. A minor offense might result in confiscation of property. A perceived insult could end in exile or even execution. This unpredictability ensures obedience, but it also breeds instability. Courtiers never know which actions will bring reward and which will bring disaster. The oprichnina emerges as the ultimate manifestation of this strategy. In 1554, Ivan divides his realm, placing certain lands under direct Tsar control. A personal guard is created, loyal not to the state or law, but solely to him. The oprichniki enforce obedience, seize property, and execute those deemed traitors. They operate under the shadow of secret orders and implicit threat, and their presence extends the Tsar's gaze into every corner of the nobility. Fear becomes institutionalized, and the boundary between governance and personal vendetta blurs. Even ordinary citizens feel the weight of Ivan's control. Taxes increase, trade is regulated, and villages are vulnerable to arbitrary inspection. Peasants and merchants learn to self-censor, anticipating potential infractions. Rumors of punishment circulate quickly. A neighbor's sudden arrest, a confiscated field, or an unexplained execution reminds everyone that survival depends on careful observation and obedience. The Tsar's reach extends far beyond the palace walls. Religious authority is both an ally and a tool. Clerics are compelled to legitimize Ivan's actions, framing them as necessary to protect the realm or uphold divine justice. Church councils are careful to balance critique with acquiescence, knowing that misstep could be fatal. The Tsar leverages this alliance to reinforce both fear and perception, portraying disloyalty as moral failing as well as political threat. Military campaigns mirror these domestic strategies. Ivan wields both strategic planning and intimidation to expand Russian territory. Commanders and soldiers operate under strict observation, aware that misjudgments may carry personal consequences. Even success is inseparable from the Tsar's perception. Reward is as psychological as material. Loyalty is measured by alignment with Ivan's moods and interpretations. Ivan's personal relationships reflect the same intensity and unpredictability. Wives, children, and close advisors navigate constant surveillance. Favor is fleeting, punishment is swift. Even familial ties are secondary to the demands of perception and control. The Tsar's gaze is unrelenting. He is both protector and potential executioner. Domestic life becomes inseparable from political strategy. Over time, the cumulative effect of these measures reshapes Russian society. Obedience is internalized, but so is fear. Public behavior aligns with Tsar expectations, even when private desire differs. Culture, commerce, and family life adapt to constant oversight. The shadow of Ivan's presence dictates not only what is permitted, but also what is imaginable. By the end of this section you can sense a profound transformation. The promise of early rule, order, expansion, and legal codification has merged with psychological domination. Fear is no longer a reaction, it is the engine of governance. The court, nobility, and even common citizens live in a state of heightened awareness, constantly negotiating the boundaries of action under an ever-watchful ruler. As you pause here, consider this unresolved question. When fear becomes the primary tool of rule, how much of society's outward stability reflects genuine order, and how much reflects invisible tension, waiting for a single misstep to unravel everything? As Ivan IV's reign reaches its later years, the consequences of his strategies become unmistakable. Moscow and the Russian state have grown in territory and influence, yet they are governed under a constant shadow. The Tsar's control is absolute, but it is exercised in ways that shape not only obedience, but the very psychology of his people. Fear has become as fundamental as law, and unpredictability as binding as decree. The oprichnina has solidified into a formidable instrument. These agents, loyal only to Ivan, patrol estates, monitor nobles, and suppress dissent. Their presence enforces obedience, yet it also generates instability. Boyars live in constant anxiety, unsure which neighbors are loyal and which will betray them to gain favor. Families are cautious, alliances fragile, and every conversation potentially dangerous. The Tsar has effectively made suspicion itself a governing principle. Ivan's personal life continues to reflect his governing style. His marriages, the survival of his children, and even household arrangements are heavily influenced by politics and control. A mistake or lapse in protocol is not just personal, it is interpreted as a political act. Courtiers and family members alike learn that intimacy is entwined with danger. Loyalty is demanded as a condition of existence, not merely of honor. Military campaigns remain effective, but psychologically taxing. Soldiers understand that success is insufficient if it fails to align with Ivan perception. Victories are celebrated, but failure, real or perceived, can provoke harsh consequences. The army becomes disciplined, not only by hierarchy, but by constant vigilance, mirroring the experience of life at court. The Tsar's gaze extends to every battlefield, every fortification, every treaty. The consequences of this governance ripple through society. Ordinary citizens internalize fear and suspicion. Commerce is cautious, disputes are mediated with care, and public expression is measured. Moscow thrives materially, yet culturally, it operates under restraint. The Tsar's presence shapes everyday choices: when to speak, what to display, whom to trust. The invisible hand of authority, is more potent than any visible enforcement. By the late years of his reign, Ivan's reputation has become legendary across Europe. Chronicles describe him as terrifying, unpredictable, yet intelligent and capable. His strategies are praised for effectiveness, but the human cost is immense. Families are displaced, nobles eliminated, and ordinary people navigate a world where misalignment with the ruler's expectations can prove fatal. Fear is both governance and legacy. Ivan's death in 1584 leaves the kingdom intact, yet deeply scarred. His policies of fear have ensured loyalty in the short term, but they have also destabilized the social fabric. Succession crises and instability follow, as the mechanisms of trust and alliance he relied upon were built on personal obedience rather than institutional strength. Moscow emerges powerful, but psychologically burdened. The lessons of Ivan's reign persist. Fear can consolidate authority, but its costs endure long after the ruler is gone. This story closes with a final thought. When governance depends on fear as its central tool, stability may be achieved, but at the cost of human trust, initiative, and social cohesion. What remains of a society shaped more by terror than law, and how long can such a system endure before it unravels from the very anxiety it created? You now travel to 17th century Spain, a kingdom that once dominated the globe, yet by the time Charles the Cunt is born, it is in slow decline. Imperial treasures have flowed in for generations, funding grand palaces, armies, and elaborate ceremonies, but also producing debt, inefficiency, and political stagnation. Into this environment comes Charles II, a boy whose body and health will shape not only his reign, but the fate of the Spanish Empire itself. Charles is born in 1560, the product of generations of intermarriage among Habsburgs. By modern standards, his family's genetic history is extreme. Cousins marry cousins repeatedly, producing a lineage that emphasizes political alliances over biological diversity. Charles' inheritance is visible from birth: a fragile body, weak constitution, and developmental delays. Yet, despite these vulnerabilities, he is immediately recognized as the linchpin of Spanish power. Without him, succession becomes uncertain, and empire teeters. Early life at court is governed by ceremonial rigidity. Tutors, physicians, and courtiers manage every aspect of the young prince's existence. Meals, exercise, and sleep are monitored. Even play is regimented to promote health. You can imagine the intensity of life for a child whose body determines the kingdom's survival. There is no ordinary childhood, only a careful orchestration of routine and oversight. Charles' physical development is slow. He speaks late, walks uncertainly, and remains weak throughout childhood. Court physicians debate constantly over diet, medications, and therapies, mixing herbal remedies with emerging scientific thought. Some prescribe stimulants, others advocate rest, yet none can fundamentally change the limitations imposed by generations of inbreeding. His body is a vessel of empire, but it is also a fragile container, vulnerable to collapse at any moment. Despite these challenges, Charles shows intelligence and sensitivity. He absorbs the lessons of statecraft, witnesses the intrigues of the court, and begins to understand the delicate balance of power around him. He is surrounded by advisors who see him both as monarch and as child, protector, and patient. Every interaction carries layers of meaning. For both instruction and observation, loyalty is demanded and earned cautiously, always with awareness of fragility. Court life during his upbringing is tense. Nobles and courtiers maneuver subtly, aware that influence over the heir can translate into power once he ascends the throne. Education, favors, and attention are all strategies for future advantage. Competition is constant, yet largely invisible, conducted in whispers, glances, and subtle gestures. The child observes, but his vulnerability also constrains him. Authority is deferred until he grows, yet the clock of succession presses steadily. The role of religion in Charles' upbringing is equally pronounced. Jesuit advisors guide moral instruction, spiritual discipline, and daily routine. Their presence shapes not only belief, but also habit, perception, and socialization. The boy learns obedience, ritual, and the intertwining of spiritual and temporal authority. Church and state are inseparable, each reinforcing the weight of inheritance that rests upon him. Even minor illnesses trigger alarm. The court reacts swiftly, sometimes excessively, in an effort to preserve the heir. Ordinary remedies, rigorous monitoring, and frequent consultations with physicians reflect both genuine concern and political calculation. Survival is never assumed. Every breath is a matter of state importance. The physical vulnerability of Charles transforms into psychological and political tension for all around him. By adolescence, Charles' development remains uncertain. His body is frail, yet his position unshakable. Advisors, nobles, and foreign diplomats watch closely, calculating alliances, anticipating influence, and preparing for a reign that may be long, short, or interrupted by sudden death. The boy's fragility becomes a constant lens through which political decisions are interpreted. As you observe this first section, notice how inheritance shapes every aspect of life. Charles is not merely a child, he is a repository of empire, whose health, education, and even moods ripple outward to affect diplomacy, policy, and social stability. His vulnerability transforms ordinary decisions, meals, exercise, or conversation into matters of political consequence. This section closes with an unresolved thought. When the survival of a state depends on a single fragile body, how much of governance is shaped by the ruler himself, and how much is dictated by the network of observers, advisors, and courtiers who manage, protect, and anticipate every movement? As Charles II grows into adolescence, the consequences of generations of inbreeding become ever more apparent. His physical limitations persist, and the court continues to adjust to the fragile reality of the heir. Every illness, delay in speech, or awkward movement is scrutinized not merely as a personal issue but as a matter of state survival. In this environment, the line between child and monarch blurs. The young prince is both vulnerable and central to imperial stability. Daily life is heavily regimented. Physicians prescribe exact diets, exercise routines, and sleeping schedules. Tutors provide lessons in history, law, languages, and religion. But each session is carefully timed and monitored to prevent fatigue or overexertion. Every activity is a balancing act between stimulating intellect and preserving health. Charles emerges as a ruler in training, whose body itself dictates the rhythm of education, governance, and court interaction. The court around him is tense and highly politicized. Nobles understand that proximity to the heir can determine future influence. Positions in the household, access during lessons, or simple attentiveness during meals can translate into favor once he ascends the throne. Rivalries are subtle whispered criticisms, carefully timed gestures, and calculated alliances. Even ordinary servants sense the stakes, adjusting behavior to avoid disfavor from the boy's guardians and advisors. Every aspect of court life becomes a negotiation of perception, loyalty, and advantage. Religious instruction plays a central role. Jesuit and other clerical advisors maintain strict oversight of both spiritual and moral development. Daily prayers, confessions, and participation in religious rituals are enforced not only for piety but also as mechanisms for discipline and psychological control. The church becomes both moral guide and political instrument, shaping the boy into a ruler who internalizes authority while remaining under constant observation. Foreign powers pay close attention to Charles' condition. Diplomats from France, Austria, and the Italian states carefully observe his physical and intellectual capabilities, estimating whether Spain's future will remain stable or fall into vulnerability. Marital alliances are proposed and debated, with health and fertility as primary considerations. Every diplomatic overture carries an implicit question: will this fragile prince survive to adulthood and produce heirs, or will the empire face crisis? The boy himself is aware of the attention, though his understanding is shaped by both instruction and constraint. Charles develops a cautious, measured personality. He observes reactions, measures speech, and learns to navigate the delicate interplay of expectation, loyalty, and obligation. The court's surveillance shapes not only his survival, but the way he perceives the world. His frailty becomes both shield and limitation, forcing diplomacy and caution in personal and political matters. Even minor health crises trigger court-wide alarm. Fevers, injuries, and illnesses are interpreted as potential political emergencies. Advisors and physicians debate constantly over treatments, combining traditional remedies with emerging medical ideas. Intervention is relentless, yet the results remain uncertain. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the political atmosphere. A fragile ruler inspires vigilance, strategic maneuvering, and anxiety at every level of governance. As Charles enters his teenage years, these pressures compound. The kingdom waits for him to mature, but his development is unpredictable. Advisors, family, and nobles attempt to compensate for weaknesses, reinforcing authority through counsel, ceremonial appearances, and careful manipulation of perception. The boy's body shapes policy as much as the law itself. Survival becomes inseparable from the mechanics of governance. Public perception also matters. Court chroniclers, foreign envoys, and ambassadors observe the young heir with constant attention. reports of his health, intelligence, and demeanor travel across Europe, influencing alliances, treaties, and diplomatic strategy. The fragile prince's personal life is inseparable from international politics, demonstrating how biological limitations can translate into geopolitical consequence. By the end of this section, Charles remains a figure both central and vulnerable. His presence stabilizes a vast empire, yet the fragility of his body casts a constant shadow over policy, alliances, and future planning. The court, nobility, and foreign powers operate as much in anticipation of his survival as in response to his decisions. As this section closes, consider this unresolved question. When the fate of a global empire rests on the health and development of a single individual, how much of history is shaped by human resilience and strategy, and how much by the vulnerabilities inherited through generations? As Charles II reaches adulthood, the consequences of his fragile inheritance become fully visible. His body, shaped by decades of Habsburg inbreeding, is weak, malformed, and infertile. He is small in stature, with physical deformities and limited mobility, and he suffers frequent illness. Yet, despite these vulnerabilities, he ascends to the throne in 1570 and rules Spain at a time when the empire still spans Europe and the Americas, though the signs of decline are unmistakable. Charles' reign is defined by the tension between authority and limitation. His physical frailty restricts direct action. He cannot ride, lead armies, or participate in ceremonial displays, as previous monarchs might have. Instead, governance relies heavily on advisors, regents, and ministers who act in his name. Every policy, every treaty, every domestic decision is mediated through others, who are acutely aware of the emperor's personal vulnerabilities and the stakes of succession. Authority is both present and diffuse, anchored in title rather than physical capacity. This dependency creates a complex court environment. Advisors compete for influence, using proximity to Charles to assert policy preferences and consolidate power. The young king's frailty amplifies this competition, as those closest to him wield the most practical authority. Courtiers and officials constantly calculate loyalty, access, and opportunity. In effect, the throne becomes a stage for negotiation, manipulation, and intrigue, with the monarch both central and constrained. Internationally, Spain appears strong in title, but increasingly fragile in execution. Foreign powers such as France, England, and the Dutch Republic watch Charles closely, assessing both his physical limitations and the political dynamics of the court. Marriage negotiations become pivotal, not only for diplomacy but for the survival of the Habsburg lineage. Fertility is paramount. Yet Charles's physical incapacity prevents the production of an heir, leaving Spain with an unresolved succession, and inviting foreign intervention. The court and advisors attempt to manage both perception and reality. Public appearances are orchestrated carefully to project dignity and stability. Ministers negotiate treaties, manage finances, and oversee colonies, often taking de facto control while presenting the illusion of unified authority. Citizens and foreign powers alike witness the trappings of monarchy, ceremonies, portraits, and rituals, but the limitations of the king's body dictate the reality behind the scenes. Power becomes symbolic as much as practical. Charles' health continues to decline over the decades. Each illness generates anxiety across the court and throughout the empire. Advisors and physicians intervene constantly, though little can alter the fundamental vulnerabilities inherited through generations of intermarriage. The fragility of the ruler becomes the fragility of the state. Policies, alliances, and succession plans are all overshadowed by the looming question of survival. By the end of his reign in 1700, Charles II leaves no heirs, producing the long-anticipated crisis of succession that destabilizes Spain and ultimately triggers European conflict over his inheritance. The empire he governed remains immense in territory, but weakened in cohesion, authority, and confidence. The weight of inheritance, both genetic and political, shapes the final chapters of his reign and reverberates across European history. Charles II's story is a vivid example of how biology, politics, and perception intersect. The survival of an empire, the ambitions of courts, and the calculations of foreign powers were inextricably tied to a single body. Decisions that shaped Europe's borders, trade, and power dynamics were influenced as much by inherited vulnerability as by human intent or strategy. This story closes with a thought-provoking reflection. When the fate of nations rests on one fragile individual, history becomes a delicate negotiation between human resilience, political design, and the unforeseen consequences of inheritance. How much of Europe's future was determined not by ambition or diplomacy, but by the vulnerability of a single monarch whose body carried the weight of an empire? You now move to 18th century Prussia, a compact but ambitious kingdom in Central Europe. Its cities are orderly, its army disciplined, and its rulers increasingly defined by intellect and strategy rather than mere inheritance. At the center of this world stands Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great, a monarch whose approach to governance is meticulous, cerebral, and at times obsessive. Under his rule, Prussia transforms from a minor state into a European power, yet every achievement is shadowed by his constant need for control. Frederick is born in 1511, the son of Frederick William, known as the Soldier King. His upbringing is rigid, almost brutal, shaped by military discipline, educational rigor, and paternal expectation. Play, curiosity, and spontaneity are strictly regulated. Every hour of the day is accounted for, from formal lessons in languages and history to physical exercise designed to strengthen the body and instill obedience. Even childhood is subordinated to preparation for rulership. Early in life, Frederick shows both intelligence and sensitivity. He absorbs complex ideas, reads widely in philosophy, history, and law, and demonstrates a keen understanding of strategy. Yet, he is also constrained by the oppressive environment imposed by his father. Mistakes or displays of individuality are punished harshly, cultivating both discipline and caution. Frederick learns to internalize authority, anticipating consequences and adjusting behavior to survive the constant scrutiny. Military discipline permeates every aspect of his development. Drills, inspections, and lessons in strategy begin in childhood. Frederick's father emphasizes obedience, hierarchy, and efficiency above all else, teaching that personal emotion must be subordinated to duty. These lessons leave a lasting imprint, shaping a ruler whose mind and actions are calculated, precise, and rarely impulsive. Even later, as king, he applies these principles not only to the army, but to every aspect of governance. Education combines rigor with intellectual curiosity. Frederick reads the classics, studies law, and engages with ideas of Enlightenment thought, although always within the constraints of practicality and authority. Philosophy is not an abstract exercise. It becomes a tool for governance, a method of understanding human behavior, and a framework for control. Frederick emerges as a ruler who blends intellect, observation, and strategic foresight into his daily management of state affairs. Court life reflects the same duality of precision and control. Frederick observes every action, gesture, and interaction. Courtiers quickly learn that favor is contingent upon both competence and alignment with his expectations. Mistakes are remembered. Opportunities for advancement are carefully monitored. Obedience is rewarded, but curiosity and initiative are permitted only within the boundaries he establishes. The court itself becomes a microcosm of his broader approach to governance, disciplined, controlled, and psychologically tuned. Administrative rigor extends beyond the palace. Frederick studies taxation, law, and infrastructure with meticulous care. Policies are implemented not haphazardly, but with foresight and exacting standards. Every province, military district, and office is observed for efficiency. Reports, inspections, and correspondence become instruments of subtle oversight. In this way, control is pervasive, affecting not only nobility, but the lives of ordinary citizens as well. Even his private life is marked by structured routines. Meals, writing, study, and leisure are carefully scheduled. Social interactions are calculated, often serving political, intellectual, or strategic purposes. Frederick maintains relationships with philosophers, generals, and diplomats in ways that reinforce his authority and provide insight into their thoughts, ambitions, and reliability. The personal becomes inseparable from the political. Military campaigns reflect the same obsessive attention to detail. Frederick plans maneuvers with precision, considers terrain, supply lines, and troop psychology, and anticipates enemy reactions. Victories are celebrated but studied, analyzed, and codified for future operations. Failures are dissected, lessons learned, and adjustments made. Control is exercised not only in execution, but in understanding, preparation, and foresight. By the end of this first section, you can see how Frederick's early life and personality shape a reign characterized by meticulous control, intellectual strategy, and the merging of personal discipline with statecraft. The foundations of his authority are as much psychological and administrative as they are military or ceremonial. As you close this section, consider this unresolved question. When a ruler governs through constant observation, preparation, and control, how much of society is truly shaped by choice, and how much is molded by the expectations and surveillance of a single calculating mind? As Frederick II assumes the throne in 1740, the patterns of his meticulous governance intensify. Prussia is small but strategically positioned, and the kingdom's survival depends on order, efficiency, and precision. Frederick approaches ruling as a disciplined commander, approaches the battlefield, scrutinizing every detail, measuring every decision, and anticipating consequences with almost obsessive care. Under his reign, control is not merely a tool, it becomes a defining principle. The court adapts quickly to Frederick's style. Courtiers and ministers learn that success depends on obedience, competence, and alignment with his expectations. Minor errors are remembered, while initiative is permitted only when it reinforces his authority. Privilege is conditional, and even high-ranking officials are subject to scrutiny. The court becomes a place of tension and calculation, where gestures, words, and alliances are constantly monitored. Loyalty is measured as much by perception as by action. Frederick's obsession with control extends to administration and policy. Provinces are surveyed for efficiency, taxation is exacting but predictable, laws are codified, and bureaucrats held accountable for compliance. Every office, from military districts to civilian administration, is structured to reduce unpredictability. Reports are read meticulously, orders are cross-checked, oversight is relentless, yet the system allows for stability and adaptation. Citizens rarely see these mechanisms, but their lives are shaped by them daily. Military matters occupy much of Frederick's attention. He implements rigorous training regimens, refines tactics, and studies both his forces and potential adversaries. Campaigns are planned with foresight, considering terrain, supply lines, weather, and morale. Soldiers understand that discipline is paramount, yet they also feel the subtle weight of expectation. Obedience is rewarded, hesitation punished, and initiative tolerated only within strict parameters. Even victory is inseparable from precise execution. Intellectual life, meanwhile, is carefully curated. Frederick surrounds himself with philosophers, historians, and artists, cultivating a court that projects sophistication and reason. Yet, even this cultural engagement serves dual purposes: aesthetic refinement and subtle observation. Advisors and intellectuals are evaluated not only on skill but on loyalty, discretion, and usefulness. Knowledge becomes both enrichment and instrument of control. Personal life is highly regimented. Meals, study, correspondence, and leisure follow exact routines. Social interactions are calculated. Relationships, even friendships, are evaluated for their utility, reliability, and alignment with Frederick priorities. He understands human behavior intimately, anticipating ambitions, fears, and desires, and often using them to reinforce authority without overt coercion. In this way, control becomes psychological as well as structural. Foreign policy reflects the same principle. Alliances, treaties, and diplomacy are carefully negotiated. Frederick anticipates the intentions and reactions of other rulers with precision, balancing aggression and conciliation. His victories in the Cilician Wars are as much a product of preparation and strategy as of military strength. Even the perception of power is carefully managed, signaling dominance without unnecessary risk. Yet, as control intensifies, the burdens of expectation and surveillance extend outward. Ministers operate with caution, nobles modify behavior to avoid displeasure, citizens internalize the rhythms of oversight and compliance. The kingdom appears orderly, prosperous, and efficient, yet beneath the surface, subtle anxiety permeates social and political life. The very effectiveness of Frederick's methods depends on continuous vigilance by all parties. By the end of this section, Prussia emerges as a highly disciplined, strategically adept state, yet its functioning is inseparable from the relentless oversight of its ruler. Authority, obedience, and stability are maintained, but the human cost, constant observation, suppressed spontaneity, and calculated behavior, is significant. Frederick's control is not absolute force, but pervasive influence, psychological as well as structural. As you consider this section, an unresolved thought emerges. When the efficiency and stability of a kingdom rely on relentless oversight, precise calculation, and anticipation of every human action, how much freedom truly exists within that society, and how much is shaped by the constant presence of a single exacting mind? As Frederick II's reign progresses into its later decades, the consequences of his meticulous approach to governance become unmistakable. Prussia is transformed. It has grown in military strength, territorial reach, and administrative sophistication. The army is disciplined to near perfection, the bureaucracy functions efficiently, and the state projects power far beyond its modest size. Yet beneath this apparent success lies the persistent shadow of the ruler's obsession with control, a shadow that shapes every interaction, every institution, and every citizen life. Frederick's personal involvement in administration is relentless. Policies are drafted, revised, and monitored with exacting precision. Ministers and officials know that oversight is constant, that reports will be scrutinized, and that decisions may be second-guessed or reversed if they do not align with the king's expectations. Mistakes are rare, but their consequences when they occur serve as reminders of the pervasive nature of authority. Even victories are framed through his interpretation and direction, reinforcing the centrality of his control. The army, Frederick's greatest instrument of power, illustrates the scale and effectiveness of his methods. Troops train rigorously, with obedience and precision emphasized above all else. Maneuvers are practiced repeatedly, and every officer learns to anticipate the ruler's expectations. Military success is as much a product of psychological conditioning and disciplined execution as of strategy or courage. Soldiers internalize the rules, ensuring that, even in the chaos of battle, the influence of the king remains present. Cultural and intellectual life also reflects Frederick's influence. Artists, musicians, and philosophers are welcome to the court, yet their work is subject to subtle oversight. Approval, patronage, and recognition are conditional upon alignment with state interests, loyalty, and refinement. Even Enlightenment ideals are carefully curated, ensuring that intellectual freedom does not undermine authority. The ruler's taste, judgment, and control extend across the spectrum of public and private life. Diplomacy is conducted with similar precision. Frederick anticipates rivals' moves, balancing military pressure, alliances, and negotiation to maximize Prussia's influence while minimizing risk. Foreign courts understand that Frederick's calculations are meticulous, and they adjust their strategies accordingly. Power in Europe is exercised not only through armies and treaties, but through the perception of competence, foresight, and relentless planning. The mind of the king becomes an instrument as effective as any army. Yet, Frederick's control has costs. Nobles operate under scrutiny, aware that their behavior is constantly monitored. Officials weigh every action and word. Ordinary citizens adjust lives to comply with laws and expectations shaped by distant observation. Spontaneity is restrained, and innovation occurs within the boundaries of tolerance established by the king. Efficiency and order are achieved, but at the cost of personal freedom and the organic rhythms of life. Despite this pervasive oversight, Frederick's reign achieves remarkable results. Prussia expands territorially, strengthens economically, and establishes itself as a major European power. His strategies prove effective in consolidating influence far beyond the kingdom's geographic size. Yet the very mechanisms that allow for these accomplishments, constant surveillance, precise orchestration, and psychological management, also ensure that the state is tightly bound to the ruler himself. Once he passes, the institutions may endure, but the energy, vigilance, and judgment that maintain them are irreplaceable. By the time of his death, in 1786, Frederick leaves a Prussia that is stronger, wealthier, and more disciplined than he inherited. His obsession with control shaped the military, administration, and cultural life of the kingdom, demonstrating the power of meticulous planning, observation, and strategic foresight. But the human cost, fear, caution, and constrained autonomy, is equally evident. Obedience is secured, yet at the expense of spontaneity, individual initiative, and freedom. As you reflect on Frederick's reign, consider this final thought. When the strength of a kingdom derives from relentless oversight, precise calculation, and control over every facet of life, how much of its stability is sustainable, and how much exists only because every actor is acutely aware of being constantly observed? Authority may endure, but the society it shapes carries the indelible imprint of a single exacting mind.